Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Joining us is fan favorite, cousin Marko Papic. He is a partner and chief strategist at Clocktower Group, if you need the reminder. He's also written a great book called Geopolitical Alpha, an investment framework for predicting the future. I'm fresh off a trip to Switzerland where I was speaking at a conference, so I'm jet lagged. Marko just got back from Panama, so he's sun-kissed and feeling good. I had a leaf blower outside my apartment for a long stretch of this, and Marko, it sounded like there was some construction going on in Santa Monica. So forgive us for any of the background noise. Hope you enjoy the show. Cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Cousin Marko, welcome back, my friend.
Cousin Jacob, what's going on?
This guy has literally been leaf blowing outside my window for approximately an hour and a half. I'm convinced he's just going around blowing the same 3 leaves so that he doesn't actually have to go and do something else. So if you hear that, I apologize.
I think it's a rival podcast that hired him to make sure that the sun isn't great. So that's why.
I like the conspiracy theory.
It's Joe Rogan. It's Joe Rogan. He's trying to nip you in the butt while you're still small.
I doubt Joe Rogan knows I exist. He hears the name Shapiro and probably wants to have Ben back on the podcast.
Fair.
One day I will be more well known than Ben Shapiro.
You won't be the biggest Shapiro, yes.
Yeah. I almost changed my name because I was worried about that shit. Anyway, man, I don't even know where to start. It's Monday, May 23rd. This will go out in about a week. Obviously, the big geopolitical news today is Biden doing, I don't understand what he's doing with his Taiwan comments. Do you understand what he's doing with his Taiwan comments? Because it's beyond me.
Well, I mean, I think it would make sense if it was accompanied then by like a wholesale sort of change in the long-standing policy of, ambiguity, strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. But it wasn't. I mean, it was walked back by U.S. officials. So that's what's kind of confusing about it. It's not the first time.
Not only was the White House walking it back, like literally right after it happened, he totally overshadowed the announcement of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is this 13-nation thing that he's saying is going to, really cement U.S. alliance structures in the region, and it's all about supply chains and this, that, and the other thing. And also, Taiwan isn't in it. So it's like, we're going to defend Taiwan, but they don't get to be in the massive supply chain thing. I'm just like, I don't get it.
Yeah, what's interesting about all of that is that I think they're also missing the big picture, which is that probably Latin America, and I know you agree with this with me, is probably just makes more sense in terms of reorienting supply chains. There are surveys out there of like U.S. multinationals doing business in China, where Mexico is actually the one place they are legitimately confident and excited about moving into. It's not India. It's not Southeast Asia. A lot of Southeast Asian economies are actually already experiencing have experienced higher wage growth. They're not that competitive anymore. India just doesn't have the infrastructure. If you look at the FDI flow into India, it's mostly for services, not manufacturing. There's absolutely zero evidence that manufacturing is in any way getting an inroad in India. Its exports are purely a result of beta growth, not alpha generation relative to other competitors. So I agree with you. I think it's a little too late, and this is kind of a grandiose plan by the State Department to increase American role in Southeast and East Asia. The fact of the matter is China's closer, it's a bigger market. They're going to dominate the economy of the region, even if they have like a crisis. Mm-hmm. It's just there. It's their economic sphere of influence.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember when you first wrote Geopolitical Alpha, and I had you on the podcast. I was fighting with you about India, and I think I've come around to you. I think you're right. I'm knee deep in a project right now, actually, about manufacturing in Latin America, and it's specifically on Mexico. And I've actually been a little surprised at how difficult the situation is in Mexico. It seems like a lot of the US firms, they want to go to Mexico, and I think some are betting on Mexico because of proximity, but it seems like Brazil is really the market that a lot of US companies are looking at. And I don't know. I mean, if not if, I mean, it looks like Lula is going to be president here by the end of the year, and he doesn't sound like he's going to be just kind of a U.S. ally and make things very easy for the United States. So, what do you think? Is Latin America really a Mexico story for the U.S.? Is that a separate thing? Like, where in the region do you think that there is that kind of stable, more dependable base for U.S. companies?
So I mean, I don't know. I haven't really thought about this a lot, but I think that there is a problem. Like countries that are slavishly allied to the U.S. are likely to be Lilliputian states that are like damsels in distress. That will highly unlikely going to have a manufacturing base of their own because they're probably economies that never invested, that never captured savings through capital controls, and then skimmed off the top of that savings to invest in the infrastructure and a domestic manufacturing capacity because probably for the last 30 years they just took the fait accompli of the Washington Consensus, which is referred to as the Washington Consensus because of the IMF and the World Bank, which were headquartered and are headquartered in Washington, D.C. So they basically took the orders of the best practices that were handed to them by essentially U.S. State Department officials, which is open up your capital account, let us come in through FDI, let our goods be sold in your economy, don't protect your industries, don't protect your manufacturing. So there's a problem, Jacob, right? Like, I was just in Panama City at a wonderful event put together by Bloomberg and my dear friend Eric Schatzker, who's awesome. And, there were all these sort of pro-American, like very American, like tilted analysts there who were saying like, open up to the US. Well, the problem is, again, if you actually did the work and like created a column of all the most pro-US countries, again, they probably abided by the American best practices that were designed specifically to ensure they didn't have the manufacturing capacity.
Yeah.
And so like now, like US is sitting there saying like, okay, who are our allies? You guys make stuff. It's like, well, you told us for the last 30 years that making stuff is for stupid countries. We all moved into services. We opened up our capital account. Our savings are gone. Like, what do you want us to do? And then you hear these like knowing nods of State Department officials like, oh, but we have to build capacity. There's capacity constraints. Our allies have capacity. Yeah, they have capacity constraints because you didn't let them protect the savings and the capacity to spend the capex on infrastructure and so on. And so what you have are countries that are ambiguously positioned towards America, like Malaysia, like Brazil, like, maybe the Philippines, Vietnam, like India. They're not allies. I just think that if the United States of America expects to build stuff in countries that are 100% aligned with U.S. foreign policy, that they're smoking something that is probably illegal in Washington D.C. and not anywhere else, and they should spread it with share with the rest of us. But the truth is that China can only it will never be replaced as a manufacturing kind of like center of the world. But if you're going to marginally like displace it, it's going to have to be other countries that are similarly probably independent in their thinking, like whether it's Turkey, whether it's India, whether it's Brazil, whether it's even Mexico. And that's okay. Like life will go on if our sneakers and phones are made in countries that will occasionally vote against the UN, against the US at the UN.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Vietnam, I think, is actually with the U.S. The problem with Vietnam is that they're full. The companies that made the bet already, there's no, that like you were talking about capacity, there really is no more spare capacity in Vietnam. So for the companies that made the move, congratulations to you. But as you said, the wages are going up and there's not a whole lot to do. It's funny. So I just got back from Geneva. You can see the jet lag on my face probably right now.
And the tan. More importantly, the tan. You're sporting a Geneva tan. Yeah.
Is that what it is? But I had a very similar experience because I was speaking to a bunch of grain traders, and they were talking about, and maybe we should talk about this too, but they were talking about the real dire effects of the Russia-Ukraine war and the global grain trade, and maybe an impending food crisis, maybe not. But one of the things that really struck me was there are a couple folks up there and officials from the UN, various things, who were talking about one of the problems with the global food system is that Africa has just not been pulling its weight. And maybe Africa can produce more food because they have lots of arable land and they haven't been producing things and they use really shoddy technology and things like that. In my head, I'm thinking, yeah, the reason they don't do that is because you wanted to sell U.S. agricultural exports to these African countries. So they didn't actually build their own domestic agricultural economies. They all grow cash crops now, like cashews and coffee and chocolate and all this other stuff that we, have as luxury items. And so they were
Like
just sort of
crops,
copying
right?
it. Yeah, and but now you just want to flip the switch and say, oh, like the Africans are really not pulling their weight. If the Africans will just kind of move forward and start, using this modern technology, things will be fine. It was just this sort of weird moment of like, yeah, the world is changing, like, but the world as it is right now, like we have to think about how it was structured to kind of benefit the United States and those allies, I guess.
No, and that's I think what's important. There's a lot of I think analysts and policymakers in the United States of America on both sides of the aisle who are waking up to how like the last 40 years didn't work for America, and the rest of the world. And I mean, I speak as someone who is American, but also am Canadian as well, and grew up in Europe and the Middle East. Like when I look at the world, I just want to laugh. I'm like, whoa, time out. The last 40 years didn't work out for America. Like, I mean, the rest of the world is laughing their asses off because it's like, well, you designed the last 40 years.
Yeah. Literally,
the minutiae detail of the last 40 years were designed by the United States of America because the challenger to the U.S. collapsed under the weight of their own socialist inefficiency. And so there is but like the rest of the world has absolutely no sympathy for this, like, violin playing about the Midwest getting high on opioids. Like, yeah, that's your fault. Like, that is 100% America's fault, America's problem. Should have redistributed that wealth, probably. Maybe you should have raised taxes. I don't know. And so the reason this is important, though, is that, this pendulum shift that you're describing with the example in Africa, or the pendulum shift of just suddenly showing up in Latin America and trying to get, like Panama to pick up the slack of global manufacturing. It's like, okay. What's I think shockingly laughable to the rest of the world is that it's Americans whose pendulum swung from laissez-faire capitalism, where the state should have no role whatsoever, to now being this obsessively dirigist command economy. And that's why I think it's an interesting political and geopolitical story we can kind of make fun of. But as an investor, I think we have to look at it very calmly and say, like, America's just not going to get what it wants. America's just not going to get its stuff manufactured in countries that pass some loyalty test. Like, that's like absolutely not going to happen. The West is not going to have this friendshoring that Janet Yellen talks about, and that's now like become like the foreign affairs, topic du jour. Like, oh, we're going to friendshore. Like, no, you're not. Because you have basically designed your friends to be sucking at the teat of the Washington Consensus for the past 4 years, and so they're actually incapable of producing a manufactured good. Whereas it's countries that, again, are quite ambiguous towards U.S. foreign policy that have the manufacturing capacity because they just didn't listen to you for the past 4 years. And that's where a country like Turkey comes into place, or a country like India, if it were to pick up slack in manufacturing. And then, like the Washington establishment being kind of shocked at India's behavior with the Russia-Ukraine tensions, where, India has basically said, look, we have our interests, we're going to keep buying Russian oil. And there's nothing the U.S. can do about it. Investors should invest in those countries. They should not invest in countries that are in friendshoring column of some State Department Excel spreadsheet. They should invest in countries that actually have the ability to say, like, sure, maybe, we'll see, we'll talk about it, we'll be friends on some issues, friends on other issues. Like, loyalty testing is just not going to work in this next decade.
Do I hear some bullishness about Turkey? I've been very, very alone on this island over here talking about what I think about Turkey recently on this podcast.
I mean, like, we're just blood in the streets, right? So why don't you tell me you're bullish? Since you've been bullish in Turkey, I think more openly than I have, and you've cooked this idea more fully than I have. Like, tell us your thesis.
Yeah, I mean, so at CI we're long Turkish equities. I should put that on the table. And the reason there's a couple different things. It's not that things aren't bad in Turkey. It's just that they aren't as bad, I think, as everybody is saying they are. And there's a couple different components to this. The first is that I don't look at Erdogan and see a crazy leader. I see a leader who might fail. He might be ushered to the exits by either in an election, like even in a rigged election, it looks like his polls are falling apart right now, and he's got over 70% inflation. So he might fail in the end. But this whole thing about getting the Turkish economy off the US dollar and getting the Turkish lira to be what, Turkish companies are actually saving their deposits in and what Turkish investors are putting their money in. Like, I get all of that. He doesn't want to be so dependent on the United States going forward. And to your point, Turkey is also soaking up a lot of manufacturing capacity. They make a lot of things. They are really the only modern industrial economy in the entire Middle East. I mean, maybe if Iran hadn't been pariahed for the last 15 years, they could have some of that, but they don't. Like, look around the Middle East, there's nobody at scale who produces things like Turkey, and they're just sitting there right on one of the most important geopolitical choke points in the world, and they're the undisputed actor there, and they can spread their influence out to the South Caucasus or to Central Asia or the Balkans. The recession of Russian power is going to be very good for Turkey as Putin's mistake comes out. So all of those things put together, to me, says that folks are underestimating Turkey, and they see Erdogan and they're running to the hills. And it's like, even if Erdogan sticks around, which I don't think it's starting to not even be the most likely scenario. I mean, there's a lot of good things going on for Turkey right now. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
I think, those are all fine points. Turkey exports a lot to the Middle East. Like Iraq, for example. I don't know what the latest figures are, but like before the pandemic, accounted for more as a share of exports of Turkish products than even U.S. And so I think the thesis for Turkey has to be that region is stable and that there's no longer, civil wars in places like Syria and Turkey and Iraq, which are big markets for Turkey. Like, I think combined Middle East is like over 20%. So that's important. I think the one struggle that I keep thinking as a macro investor is that commodity prices have to kind of abate. Now, to your point, we're talking about India, and you said 2 years ago, we talked about India. You were bullish. I was bearish, and you were like, well, I guess you were right, Marco. Well, actually, no. I mean, I was spectacularly wrong. India has been the best performing market since the pandemic, like better than the U.S. But what's interesting to me is that that's come at the end of one of the closest macro relationships in finance. Like, commodity prices and Indian assets were one-to-one negatively correlated, and yet somehow that has not impacted India at all. I don't know if India and Turkey can both kind of like maintain performance as investment thesis if commodities don't come off their highs a little bit. So that's the only caveat I would have for both.
Well, stick on the India point for a bit. I'm a little surprised because I feel like India's kind of peaked. Like, they sort of hit their peak, like market-wise, November, December 2021. And I mean, they're hanging around a little bit, but it kind of feels like things have turned against them, and they're going into, you've got this heat wave, which has been blowing up all of their best laid plans. You've got the Reserve Bank of India talking about how they're really worried about inflation and basically signaling that the high growth era is over. So, I mean, I think you might have been a little early, but I don't think that.
Well, no, like when you're wrong for 2 years, you're wrong. I appreciate you. This is why we're cousins. I'm giving you like compliment for being right. You're like, no, Marco, you were right. We're like, no, Jacob, you're right. The truth is, like, look, India has outperformed for 2 years, and massively so. Like, outperformed the EM peers, the U.S. But why? Why? And I think it's like. I think it's three really reasons. One, Modi continues to be very popular even to this day, unlike, let's say, Erdogan. He keeps winning elections, and business confidence in India is really high because he is a pro-business leader. Now, if you scratch under the surface, he did go back on like both land and labor reforms. So, but nobody seems to care. Business confidence remains high, and for good reason. Like, he's a pro-business person, so let's leave that aside. I think you can still say that's checked. The other two reasons, though, are kind of ephemeral. One, it's the anti-China trade. It's a large equity market, and when China started regulating its TMT sector and starting to like tinker with the way that it regulates just capitalism, a lot of people who have to invest in emerging markets, just reallocate it to India. I don't know if that's sustainable because that can be a sentiment shift for like a year, 18 months, but like it can't last forever. And then the last thing was the TMT sector, the nature of the TMT carnage in China. Investors who are, laden with tech wanted to find an alternative to China. So they found it in India. It's an EM market. It's the third largest market in terms of unicorns in the world, by the way, after US and China, bigger than the UK. And there's, we are very, like, for example, my firm has a fintech fund that is deployed in Latin America. We're very seriously looking at India. There's a lot of plays there. But the problem from a macro perspective is that this is a country that's not going to advance through services. It just doesn't have enough employment in the service sector. So those three reasons to be bullish for India for the last 2 years, I just feel I agree with you. I think for all the reasons you've listed, the central bank getting more hawkish, the fact that a lot of that investment went to services, not manufacturing, and the fact that commodity prices are going to start weighing on India politically and fiscally. I think those are all the reasons to not expect them to continue to outperform.
Yeah, and they're also one of those countries that, climate change really sucks for India. It's going to suck for a lot of countries, but it really, really sucks for them. And that government has just not done a good job of managing things. There are cities in India that routinely are running out of water in the summers. They can't control the monsoon seasons. This whole about face on agriculture, they went from saying they were going to feed the world to suddenly just restricting wheat exports, and then nobody knew what the hell was going on because they started tinkering with the laws as well. I just don't think any of that's going to end well from them, and that's already with their really shoddy level of infrastructure. So I don't know. I'm hemming and hawing here because I want to root for India, but it's very hard to with the current set of circumstances we have in front of us, I think.
Yeah, I think I agree.
All right, we're 20 minutes in. We haven't talked about Russia-Ukraine. We should probably talk about the Russia-Ukraine war a little bit. I don't. Did you expect the Ukrainians were going to be able to do this? I feel like we have to start considering the scenario that the Ukrainians are going to win, that they're going to take back territory from Russia, and that Putin's wall back is really going to be against a wall. Where are you right now with where Russia's at?
No, I'm not surprised by pretty much anything that's happened in the war itself. I think we talked about this. I assigned way too high probability for a bluff scenario. I said it was 50% bluff, 50% attack, and then that 50% of attack was different scenarios. The reason that I assigned such a high probability to a bluff was that I expected that if the Russians were stupid enough to attack the country, they would face what they're facing now. We have absolutely no evidence of a modern Russian army actually being competent at anything. Their intervention in Georgia in 2008 was a disaster. They obviously won because Georgia is tiny, but there were a lot of problems in that attack, and they were supposedly fixed through a massive investment in the Russian military, which they weren't. The Syria conflict, everybody points to and says, but Marko, what about Syria? They did so well in Syria. They did what in Syria? They didn't fight the war in Syria. They gave Assad, the president and the government troops, they provided them with basically 24 or some number of 1960s Sukhois with ground attack Sukhois. And the combatants against the government of Syria were basically Islamic militants who did not have an air force. So it was this was not a war. The one war that people should have been watching was the one in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, where Russian-backed rebels did not conquer Mariupol and were stuck in controlling 40% of Donetsk and Luhansk. So that's all the evidence we had of the Russian performance. And then when they invaded Ukraine, the day they invaded, I wrote several analyses for my clients that basically said, this is the most ridiculous attack I've ever seen in my life. Starting with the fact that they did nothing to clear out Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles. They did not gain air superiority. And then from the multiple locations, multiple directions. Had they focused on just Donbass, maybe it would have been different. But, I agree with you. I don't know if Ukrainians can start winning back territory. I think that's going to be difficult. I think the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk that now need to be conquered by Russia are relatively flat, relatively rural. So that should be relatively easy for Russian, tank columns to kind of conquer. Luhansk is going to be in their hands pretty soon. I don't know what's happening in Donetsk, but if they can't conquer the rest of Donetsk, that's just the end of Russia as we know it. So I would assume they get that, and then I assume they do what I said at the very onset of this war. I think this is going to be a much shorter conflict than anyone else. I've been on that corner from day one. I think Russia's going to have to raise the mission accomplished banner, like Putin's going to land somehow haphazardly on the only aircraft carrier that's probably going to be tugged by a Spanish tugboat, as it always does when he transits through the Gibraltar Straits because he breaks down 16 times. And they're going to proclaim victory. They have to. They absolutely have to. Now, are they irrational? Are they going to use tactical nukes? I would just say to that, well, I do think the Russian leadership is very rational, because once they got spanked in north of Ukraine, they responded by not tripling or quadrupling down. They withdrew and they reoriented their mission prerogatives. So that illustrates to me that they are aware of their constraints and they're adjusting their behavior to them. What do you think?
Well, I wanted to ask you, I believe right after it happened, one of the things you said was that you gave Putin 12 months. Are you still giving him 8 months or whatever he has left, or you think he sticks around?
Yeah. Well, that was, when I do these podcasts, as you can see, my button is unbuttoned a little bit. I've had coffee. I was doing a great Mike Rogan over on Bloomberg had me on the podcast, and I love his podcast. It's amazing. And by the end of the podcast, things got loose. He asked me, "What do you think is going to happen?" And the truth is that there's a long history of Russian military and Russian leaders taking the country the wrong way through offensive military operations that don't end up working out, and then there's a political consequence. Is it 12 months though later? No. On average, it's 2 to 3 years. But whatever. I just threw it out there, and then the Bloomberg editors, who are very fine editors, very good at drawing out the juiciest parts of your views, they wrote that up and they tweeted it. And so there's a tweet of me saying, I give Vladimir Putin 12 months or less, and I'm taking the under, says Marko Papic, geopolitical expert. And then somebody said to that, I give Marko Papic 12 months or less, and I'm taking the under, says Russian President Vladimir Putin. So, I would say that I don't see how Russia proclaims victory when everybody knows it isn't. And the leadership in the Kremlin survives for a very long time. And that's because Russia is not North Korea. It just isn't. And Russian people are not they're historic. People tell me, oh, Russians can endure pain. What does that mean, first of all? This is a country that's had more revolts against its own leadership than almost any other, civilized country ever in history of mankind. Russia has a history of its own people getting angry. It has a history of that. That is documented. And so, yes, whether they endure pain or not is irrelevant. Russians themselves, through history, have proven to not want to endure pain for idiotic, useless reasons. And I can't tell you, Jacob, how much I am absolutely shocked by the number of folks in the West who are bending over backwards to imbue Moscow's strategic decision to make this blunder with some sort of a logical explanation. I've heard everything from it's the NATO expansion, it is natural resources, which is complete horseshit.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the neon gas. You and I can make neon gas in a freaking kitchen. Neon gas is not a natural resource. Neon gas is a product that you can manufacture. Yeah, it takes some time, blah, blah, blah. But no, Russia has basically decided to prove to the rest of the world that they're a military joke. They have destroyed their greatest resource as a country, which is a veneer of invincibility. The fear they project, that's gone, and they did it so that they can conquer Europe's West Virginia. So my answer to you is 6 months from now, the median Russian voter is going to take a cold shower, the patriotism, which is, running strong right now. And I don't want to use the word nationalism. Hey, look, everyone's against Russians. Everyone's telling Russians they're a pariah state. God bless them. They have a reason to be angry about that. Their athletes can't compete. people are angry at them, blah, blah, blah. Like, there is patriotism that's running high. Even if you were like miffed at the current regime, you probably have sympathy for it, given the ganging up in the West. But that's going to end 6 to 12 months from now. And when it ends, I do think that the anger will boil over and the Russian public will say, like, hold on a second, we did all of this so I can vacation in like bombed out Mariupol so that we have more coal and we already have a lot of coal. Like, what exactly does the winner get here? I think that's what's going to happen. So yeah, I do think that there's trouble ahead for policymakers running Russia. Absolutely.
Yeah, we had a Russia analyst on this podcast maybe a month ago now. Andrei Sushentsov. Sorry, Andrei. And it was a great episode, but I will say the one moment where I was like, because we were talking about, he mentioned the U.S. movie The Avengers or something like that, and I asked him, like, in Russia, do you all watch The Avengers, or do you have like Russia, like what exactly are you guys watching in Russia when you're trying to watch movies? And he gave this answer that was like, well, we watch movies of the Great Patriotic War and documentaries on the Great Patriotic War to feel the like patriotism of Mother Russia. And I was like, wow, that's definitely not true. But to your point, I mean, I'm winding up for a question here. I'm not sure what's going to happen with Putin in Russia, and I've been wrong enough on a couple of these things now with Russia that I'm a little trigger shy. I will say, though, it seems clear to me that Russia is going to get weaker over time for a lot of the reasons that you say. And that, to me, says Central Asia and the South Caucasus and even the Balkans, as Russia recedes from those areas or is not able to project its normal level of influence or invincibility or whatever you want to call it there, that those regions are all going to be up for grabs. And I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, but I wanted to ask you, so let's assume we're right about Russia here, which has been a dangerous thing for you and me over the past couple of months. What's the other side of that trade? What do investors need to think about in terms of Russia receding, or is there really nothing to play here? It's just kind of watch that happen and continue about your business in Latin America or in sort of these middle tier powers that are rising up?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the ultimate trade would be re-rating of Russian assets. I mean, Russia is, has been in a bear market, pun intended, for a decade. And it has incredible wealth. It has incredible human capacity, despite its poor demographics. I mean, this is a country that obviously is the largest commodity exporter, not just energy, metals. We have a green transition that the world is trying to accomplish. It's not going to get accomplished without Russia. And so I think the biggest trade would be to buy Russia at some point, because Russia has a, change of basically regime. But other than that, I think it's really difficult to see what other regions would benefit from weakening of Russia. Belarus or like Central Asian economies are just not big enough for investors to in any way deploy assets in public markets. I just don't think it matters that much. I mean, we forget that Russia has an economy, has a GDP less than of Texas. So it's just like not that much relevant. But I will say one thing. I think what many analysts in the West have failed, and I thought Russian leadership was more rational than it was. That was my mistake. But my assessment of Russian capabilities has been probably more right than anyone out there, other than maybe David Petraeus, who was very publicly active before the conflict, saying that Russia was going to lose and get its ass kicked. And one of the reasons for that is that you have to understand, like, power is not something you go on Wikipedia and copy paste like order of battle and are like, ooh, Russians have 600 fourth generation fighter jets, they must win. I mean, power comes from other ways to calculate as well. One of them is a credibility of threat. One of them is the fact that you have proven, basically your ability to incur high costs for military operations. And again, like, Russia hasn't done that in the last 30 years. Like, Great Patriotic War was a freaking long time ago. And oh, by the way, Hitler invaded Russia, it pissed him off. Like, that was a completely different scenario. You're talking about a country that couldn't win a war in Chechnya. Like, Chechnya was de facto independent from 97 to 2002 because, in part because the Russian losses in that first Chechen war, over 4,000 or 5,000, were too much for the society to bear in the 90s. So I'm not sure how Russia has gotten tougher over the last 30 years of a commodity bull market. somehow like today's Russians who are, bored and watching YouTube are willing to incur 20, 30,000 troop losses, but 1990s Russians were willing 5,000. So my point here is that I think, like how we measure power is, I think, it has to be improved. And one of the things that's happening right now is that credibility of threat is collapsing. Credibility of Russian threat has absolutely collapsed in the West. Nobody sees their threat as credible. And, when I speak to Americans, most of the time they're shocked that I say that. They're like, but they invaded Ukraine. I'm like, yeah, and they lost. Like, why do you think Finland and Sweden are so, like, nonchalant about joining NATO, despite the fact that Russia's next door and can threaten them, can nuke them, all this stuff? It's because nobody believes it anymore. And so I think that that's really, really shocking of a loss for Russia. It's this esoteric, qualitative, loss of a credible threat. That's the biggest loss. It's bigger than the casualties. It's bigger than the military equipment. It's bigger than, what's happening in Ukraine. The biggest one is psychological. No one's afraid of them. And you'll see when Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan start being like, you know what? We're not going to do that. And these are countries that were already on poor terms with Russia. When they start, raising their voice, I think you will see that the emperor is wearing no clothes. But again, from an investment perspective, it's tough to see how that really matters, because the Russian sphere of influence is so paltry. There's nothing for us to do in there.
Yeah, I mean, Azerbaijan was already giving the middle finger to Russia with the Nagorno-Karabakh war, and Russia did nothing there because I guess Russia, it said, Armenia, sorry, you're on your own. And I guess we should have known something from that as well.
Well, and that's why, so maybe, so that's a great point. I mean, maybe one of the things that could happen is that we will finally get the Trans-Caspian, pipeline infrastructure that has been basically blocked by Russia for so long. You have Azerbaijan natural gas going to Europe, but, the Central Asian natural gas really transits through Russia. And so that's been one of the things that has given Russia, an upper hand to set the prices for natural gas that transit through Russian territory into Europe and to feed those into pipelines. And so maybe one of the things that can happen is finally Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan can be like, let's resolve our differences, let's build this pipeline. Maybe you can have that pipeline through Iran, which is, of course, the holy grail that a lot of people have been trying to build. Central Asia, Iran, boom, LNG terminals. There's a lot of things that could be done to get gas to Europe and the global market that doesn't involve complete wholesale change of the LNG infrastructure in the US, which, by the way, is going to cause natural gas prices in the US to skyrocket. This is something that I think a lot of people don't think this through. Once we start selling a lot of LNG to Europe, that will equalize prices between North America and the rest of Europe, causing US customers to pay more natural gas, which is fine. It's how life goes, but I think there's other alternatives, and maybe that's one of the investment implications.
Yeah, put a pin in that. I want to come right back to that, but I want to ask you one more thing on this before we close this topic, because what you just said was on my list of questions. But to close it off, I will say, I was just at this grain conference, and I was really struck by they put these two Ukrainian farmers in one of the late afternoon sessions, so there weren't a lot of people there. And for me, it was the most interesting panel in the whole conference, because they were basically like, look, guys, we had a record year the year before because of all the high food prices and things like that. So we saved up and we stocked up, and we're okay for this year. And we can talk about getting things out through rail and this, that, or the other thing. But you don't seem to understand that if we can't get things out through the Black Sea, and if we don't get fertilizer from the Russians next year, because all our fertilizer comes from Russia and Belarus, and the fertilizer that doesn't come from Russia and Belarus, we make with natural gas that comes from Russia. So there's literally nothing for us here. If we can't turn this around by 2023, if Russia's still blocking our ships out of the Black Sea in 2023, if we're not importing fertilizer in 2023, there's no Ukrainian grains. There's no corn, there's no wheat, there's no sunflower. It's all over. So we need to figure out how to open up the Black Sea by 2023 or things are screwed. And one of the things that was happening in the room, I thought, was that people were saying, oh, this Russia-Ukraine war can go on for a year, 2 years, maybe even more. I think you're going to say that Russia's going to declare mission accomplished before then, and there's going to be some kind of agreement to open the Black Sea, and they'll work something out so that things don't go catastrophic. Is that what you think, or are you worried that wheat and corn and all these other commodities that Ukraine exports could have another leg up because of a protracted conflict?
Look, I mean, I think a lot of times when people talk about these supply chain issues, they just don't use imagination. Like there's ports in the Baltic. There are roads from Ukraine to like Lithuania or to Poland or to Germany. So, things can be brought into and out of Ukraine via other alternative sources. Like not by 2023 necessarily, but like it's not like a 1 or a 0. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is like, yeah, I mean, I do think that Russia's going to have to declare victory by, the summer. I mean, they cannot sustain this pace. Now, does that mean they open up the, like Black Sea to Ukrainian shipping? Like, I don't know. They're obviously going to want that as a negotiating tool. But 2023 is a long time from now. So I'm not sure that we're going to face an apocalypse, but obviously probability is not 0. And I respect that. The thing is, like, I think we were headed for a food crisis. I thought that was my number one risk, geopolitical risk in 2021. And I thought Russia, Ukraine, 50-50. So it wasn't because of that. So I think that no matter what happens, we have problems on our hands, and that's going to cause a lot of political risk in a lot of different places in the world, for sure, 100%.
Yeah. Already is. All right, let's go back to the Europe natural gas thing. Where is Europe going to get its energy going forward? I mean, the Germans are still dragging their feet about nuclear for reasons I cannot comprehend. I could comprehend it when you were getting everything from Russia, but if Russia's off the table, like, stop it. Like, let's just go with the nuclear. Where is Europe getting its energy going forward?
It's not. I mean, it's going to be Russia. Like, there's no alternative. Like, there's no, like. I mean, look, the oil embargo that everyone is so focused on is a joke. Oil is a fungible commodity. Europe is going to put an embargo on Russian oil, and then Russia's going to sell to like country X, and then Europe will buy more oil from where that country used to buy. Now I'm being facetious. I'm simplifying it. Blah 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 blah. But like, yeah, like relax. Like oil is one thing. Natural gas cannot be replaced in Europe very quickly. Now, yes, LNG exports from the U.S. are surging. U.S. is now the largest LNG exporter in the world, which happened shockingly fast. And so, yeah, like Europe will replace some of Russia's natural gas through more LNG imports from the U.S. But I think that Europe will continue to import natural gas from Russia for decades. And the truth is, like, this is why the conflict in Ukraine kind of happened. It happened because Europe was not willing to put its foot down when it came to Russia. And so it signaled kind of a soft opening. But it's not like, I know the diplomats and everything are talking about this right now, like they're united and they're firm. Like come winter of 2022, which is not that far off from now, it's like 4 or 5 months from now. What option do Europeans have? So that's why I think that this is a much longer process than people think. And that's why I don't think it's going to change. And that's why Russians have not cut off natural gas to Europe. They've cut it off to specific, like to Poland and Bulgaria, and now to Finland. But they haven't done it to Germany. They haven't done it to Italy. And they haven't done it because they themselves depend on this revenue for a lot. And also they, there's a symbiotic relationship that's not going to end tomorrow because of rhetoric. Now, that said, there is definitely epic change in this market. And I think the biggest change is how LNG in the US is going to play a much bigger role globally. My friends Gering and Rosenzweig, very difficult to spell their name. I don't know if you've ever had them on your podcast. So Adam, Rozencwajg, and Gering is spelled Goehring. Sorry, I usually don't spell names when I name drop someone, but you really should Google them. They run a commodity fund. The research is for free. So you can go on their website, and they had this excellent piece. It was a first quarter report published this May 18th, and it's the gas crisis is coming to America. I would really encourage everyone to download it from the internet and read it. I love to name drop people when I steal their ideas because, I did start my career in academia. Footnoting is I respect when people have a great piece of research. And this was a really good, really interesting report where basically what Gering and Rosenzweig write about is like, look, like once U.S. shale becomes untrapped, once it's no longer trapped on the North American continent, like natural gas will become a much more of a fungible commodity. LNG will create more of a oil type scenario, and that means that the number one consequence of the Russia-Europe conflict is not that Europeans are stupid and their energy is going to go up, but that American energy is about to get a lot more expensive. Because once American natural gas is no longer trapped on the island of North America, it will have to attain price levels of global natural gases. And that means something like 4 or 5x jump in natural gas prices in the US. So that is an interesting investment opportunity, first and foremost. But two, it's going to be something that US is going to have to deal with over the next couple of years as it exports more of that LNG externally.
Shout out to my high school best friend, Nat Rosenzweig, which is why I can pronounce and spell that name in my sleep.
Okay,
but,
nice.
I doubt he listens to this. This isn't really a podcast for Nas, but if he's listening, what's up, Nas? Why wouldn't the U.S. just restrict gas exports?
Yeah. I mean, it did it with oil, right? So, so okay, if it does, Europe will keep buying natural gas from Russia. Like this is where the constraint framework is so important. Like, I get it, Europeans are mad. There's lots of refugees from Ukraine. Russia has done something no one's done since the Second World War. Russians are aggressors. This is, there's no really good strategic reason why they did this. It's like the civilian deaths are huge. A lot of politicians in Europe have to get reelected, and when people can't afford to heat their homes in the winter, like there is a limit to what you can do. And so I just think the obvious answer here to your question, to your point, is like, okay, fine. The U.S. government may restrict LNG exports, and that means the investment thesis of astronomically higher natural gas prices in the U.S. is wrong, but then Europe will continue to buy Russian natural gas.
Yeah, because I would think, like, this may sound anathema to listeners, but before the early 1970s, there were organizations in the United States that were in charge of regulating oil production to keep prices within certain limits. And it was usually the U.S. was an exporter at this point and had a lot of price control. So we're probably going to have to go back and learn how to do all those sorts of things. And I mean, Texas was even talking about doing this kind of, was it right before the pandemic or right after the pandemic? I can't remember what it was. So I would think that they're going to restrict things, but I would push back a little bit on the idea that you don't think Europe's going to change here? They're not going to go in on renewables and figure out a brave new world and try and get themselves off of Russia? I mean, in Germany, the Greens are the ones that are surging up in the polls right now because they're toughest on Russia. It seems like there's appetite for that.
Well, I mean, yes, within economic reasons. So, like, I'm definitely bullish on the Greens transition. We have a climate sustainability fund at Clocktower where we're investing in these technologies. It's the future. It's not a 1 or a 0. Like, Europe, as it's transitioning, will continue to buy Russian natural gas.
Sure, but in decreasing amounts, and in 3 years, I mean, how long does it take for them to wean themselves off of their series?
Not 3 years.
3 years? 4 years?
Why Russia sends Russia sends 200 BCM to Europe a year. I just don't see how that gets replaced.
Well, you get the Qataris to send you some, maybe get a little deal with the U.S. to send you some, maybe a little more wind, a little more hydro. I saw the Italians signed a gas deal with the Republic of Congo. That's probably going to solve everything, right?
I mean, I just, hey, by the way, if there is any truth in the forecast, my hyperbolic forecast that Russia will experience political risk and like a leadership transition, not violent, but like maybe well orchestrated, maybe civilized, maybe a Khrushchev type of a deal. If anything like that happens, then of course Europe will continue to buy natural gas from Russia, because purportedly that will help grease the wheels of that relationship going forward. And ultimately, natural gas is as good for climate change as it gets from a fossil fuel. So it just makes sense, to continue, burning.
Are you conspiratorial enough to think that the European Commission is very, very mad at Hungary in public, but in private likes that they're holding up all of the worst sanctions? Is that how I should read what's going on in Budapest?
I'm usually extremely non-conspiratorial, but I think in this case I've thought of it myself. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, It just makes it, look, the biggest source of public unrest in Europe over the last 5 years was not immigration. It wasn't the migrants. It wasn't euro area crisis. It wasn't austerity. It was an energy crisis in France in 2018. That's what the Gilets jaunes were about. Yellow vest protests in France. That, like that was it. And that was before oil was at $110. So that's just something for people to kind of remember. Like the last crisis in Europe, political crisis, was about energy. And it was like 4 years ago. Of course it can happen again.
All right, last thing before we get to basketball. Is the U.S. in recession? Will it be in recession soon?
I don't think so. I don't think it will be in a recession soon. The U.S. consumer is, like the consumer sentiment is very dire. It's very, very poor. But I almost feel like American consumers are, always complaining. And that's going to sound terrible. You're going to get hate mail. Who's this elitist who like blah, 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 blah.
It's fine. My name is literally Jacob Shapiro, and I put my face out to talk about politics. I get hate mail no matter what I do.
Okay, awesome. Well, look, like inflation is high, but unemployment is at 3%. Okay, like to fix inflation, you're going to get unemployment up to 10%. So awesome. I just don't see the Federal Reserve doing that. I think that what's going to happen over the next couple of months is growth will slow down in the U.S. as it naturally would have no matter what. The momentum is going to wane of this kind of like a massive binge on goods. It will switch to services, which are more difficult to binge on, by the way. And that process will slow down the pace of growth. The PMI, manufacturing PMI, is going to come near recessionary levels by the end of the year. So that's why it's a tough call. And then you have global growth, which is slowed down because of the conflict in Europe, because of Chinese zero policy, and so on. This will create a disinflationary impulse that will ensure that CPI basically peaks right now and starts trending much lower. I think by the end of the year, we could be as low as 5% of the CPI. Now, a lot of folks out there are saying like, well, but they want to get it under 2%. What? Says who? I totally don't buy that. That's total bullshit. Why would the Fed need to get the CPI under 2% in like 8 months? Why is that a necessity? They will simply say at some point, as hashtag recession fears rise and hashtag inflation dissipates, they'll say something. They'll invent another idiotic terms of transitory, except they'll say something like, well, we're asymptotically approaching our target. And so I would suspect that by the end of the year, the Fed will go back to 25 basis point rises. They'll temper down their hawkish rhetoric. And, we won't get a recession this year. But I do think we're at the end of the cycle. All the signs are pointing to a late cycle environment, which means that a recession is a very tough call over the next 12 months. The reason it matters for professional investors is that the last decile of any cycle is usually the second most lucrative decile to be in risk assets. And that's why it's such a difficult call on equities right now. Like, I think way too many people think we're in a bear market and it's game over. It may be, but if it's not and you're a professional investor, you're going to miss a really big upturn. Now, if you're running a family office or if you're managing your own PA, it's perfectly reasonable to be in cash and like thinking about what you're going to deploy your assets right now, because like you don't have to beat the benchmark. You're not, your bread is not buttered by like beating a benchmark and chasing that last decile.
Yeah. All right. Basketball. What you got? I've been wrong about everything with basketball. Who do you think is going to the finals? First of all, I mean, it seems obvious it's the Warriors in the West, but is it Heat or Celtics in the East?
So, I mean, do we know what happened to Marcus Smart and Jason Tatum? Like, are they going to play? I mean, it's nutty. I would have thought that the Heat would have no chance against the Celtics.
Same.
Right? Celtics are just like, it's such an incredible team because they've been like, it seems like this team has been together for so long. I mean, this team basically, like the exact same team, almost took LeBron James. I mean, almost beat LeBron James. Like, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah.
It's incredible. Pre-pandemic, yeah. And here they are. And I think that's really impressive. Great job in like letting a team mature together. Like growing pains of like the people, like everybody in Boston kind of had a love and hate relationship with Marcus Smart. Tice was like traded. Horford left. They both came back. I just really like that when that happens, Jacob. When teams let chemistry develop, when they let growing pains be growing pains. They don't overreact, and I think that's really impressive. I'm a Laker fan. If the Celtics win another championship, that sucks. We're no longer tied. Blah blah blah. But like, I'm just so impressed with what they've done, and I would be surprised if they go to the finals. That said, I would still take the Golden State Warriors. I mean, they are clicking on all cylinders. I just don't see why they wouldn't beat the Celtics.
I will say, to your point, it's really nice that 3 out of the 4 teams in the finals, I think, match what you're talking about in terms of teams that allowed their core to have time together. I mean, that seems to be what Miami has. Golden State is the poster child for this.
Even Dallas.
Well, Dallas is just Luka and whatever they're able to throw around him. They're going to have to figure out what to throw around him, because I feel like he's pigeonholing himself into one of these incredible 1-on-5 players, but he's doing too much. He's an incredible passer too. He's got to figure out how to get more people involved around him, I guess. I don't know. But I mean, he's incredible. Like, nobody can stop him.
No, listen, you and I have talked about this, I think, on this pod before. Like, the James Hardenization of the NBA doesn't work, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened. And a lot of teams have done that, and it's happened because of the power dynamics, I think, between players and management. And what I mean by that is, like, if you're a moderately successful player in a crappy team, you're going to want to be James Harden. You're going to want to have the stats. Devin Booker, by the way, before they brought in the coach and before they brought in Chris Paul, was James Harden. He was 1-on-5. He was 5 and out. This whole like style of play, and it doesn't work in the playoffs because you have 5 pairs of eyes watching you while you dribble for 14 seconds.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. And what they need to do with Luka is they need to sit him down in front of the TV and just play like Larry Bird, Grant Hill. Okay, Grant Hill didn't do anything in the playoffs but these small forwards, in the 90s who played in an in-between game, who had this ability to post up. And he's such a great post-up player.
He is.
Like, get Luka in the post, get him in a high post, move him off the ball so he can be a triple threat instead of being a double threat dribbling 4 feet off the three-point line. But that requires him to want to do this. Now, I love Luka. Obviously he's from the Balkans. He's my bro. He sports the same form of flabby athleticism like Nikola Jokic that I can now claim is like the new thing. Like, there's no muscle definition, and yet it's Luka strong. He's made every flabby dude in the world feel confident, like body confident, So I love Luka. I love him. He's my favorite player I've had in a very long time. It's just that I think he himself has to look inside of himself and say, like, I need to give up the ball, like MJ did, like Kobe did, like all these other greats. He needs to play off the ball more.
Yeah. So you think it's the Warriors? I mean, it's kind of hard to argue against them right now. They seem to be clicking. I mean, Kevin, what do you think Kevin Durant is doing sitting in his basement right now? I mean, wow, must feel bad.
It's that great. Bill Simmons talks about this all the time. Like the Pat Riley, I think, book where he talks about the disease of more. And it is like incredible how this core of Golden State Warriors have never been infected with it. And by the way, I love sports. I played sports all my life. I almost became a coach in basketball. And the reason that you and I have these conversations is not just because we love basketball. It's also because there's so many analogies to trying to build a chemistry in a team. And I think what's really important is to create a team of individuals who can, when things go bad, like that's easy. That's when actually there's no atheists in the foxholes, and we have a whole litany of terminologies of how to deal when things go bad. But what I would say is that the biggest challenge to anyone who leads a team in business or anywhere else is, what do you do when you are successful? And how do you deal with this success? And I think that Pat Riley's book, where he talks about the disease of more, is something that you have to pre-game for. And you have to pre-game it by hiring and training and nurturing individuals who are going to be willing to set off the ball picks, no matter what is happening in the world. And that's what the Golden State Warriors are. Like, literally, they're literally set off the ball picks, like literally. And I think that defines a great teammate in business, in markets, or in sports. Are you willing to set the off the ball picks even if you make $250 million a year?
Yeah, and I also think this goes to, I mean, one of my hobby horses, which is that I feel like a lot of the folks in our industry discount the importance of leadership and especially political leadership overall. And I mean, basketball is a great example of how, I mean, your team is going to take on the character of your best player or whoever's calling the shot. So the reason the Warriors work is because Steph Curry is not an asshole. Like, he wants to spread the wealth. He's happy. He wants to move things around. He's very generous. I mean, it feels like Tim Duncan in that same way that Tim Duncan set the tone for the Spurs. The Heat reflect Jimmy Butler. Like, it's very obviously like, get at your lunch pail and let's go to work, and nothing matters. We're going to be a little crazy sometimes, and sometimes we're going to miss a game here and there, but like overall, we're going to put in work. And I also think that's true of political leaders. Like, I think sometimes we don't even want to reflect political leadership, but whoever's in charge and whoever is making the decisions and whoever's doing the daily press conference, that shit trickles down, which is why it matters when Donald Trump is the president of the United States. Even if you don't like Donald Trump, if that is the guy that is the focus of all the attention, those things are going to subconsciously kind of trickle down. Same thing with somebody like Putin. Like, it all works together. So I agree with you. I'm stretching here to make basketball and geopolitics talk to each other, but I do think there is something in leadership there.
You know what I would say about that though. I think what's important. I want to be on the same page as you with this, because I'm not an asshole. Anyone who works for me knows this. And I'm very prideful of that. But Michael Jordan was an asshole. To do a counter example to what you're talking about. I mean, he was almost to a point where he is celebrating how psychotic he was. That's what the pandemic, documentary was. He was celebrating how, and I took that personally, which is awesome. Great meme. And yet he was successful. And so what I would say is, you can be an asshole and a leader. The issue to me is, are you willing to sacrifice yourself? That's, for your teammates. And so while Michael Jordan may have punched Steve Kerr in a practice, he would have taken someone's head off if they picked on Steve Kerr in a game. And so what's, I think, important is that, and leadership goes to this too, you can be an asshole as a leader, but are you creating an esprit de corps? Are you creating this chemistry of togetherness? Or are you dividing? And I call this, in business, are you focused on growing the pie, or are you focused on your own slice? And Michael Jordan went from being a slice person when he won his first MVP. I think his first MVP was '88. I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. And Phil Jackson shows up, and basically, what does Phil Jackson do? He instituted the triangle, which is a joke. I've coached the triangle. It's like a ridiculous offensive system. It's bullshit. It's complete bullshit. But what the triangle did is it slowed the game down, and it forced every single one of Jordan's teammates to touch the ball with their hands in an offensive possession, so that they feel empowered, so they feel good, so there's a esprit de corps, so that on the other side, they'll take the hard foul. They'll set up picks for MJ. They'll do the hard work, right? They'll crash the offensive boards. And MJ was okay with that, because he realized, okay, I need to involve my teammates, not because they're actually good, not because they're better than me, but because I can't win without them. He was still an asshole, but he was one that understood that esprit de corps is how you're going to win and grow the pie. He wasn't chasing his slice anymore. And I would say that there's many people in our industry who are extremely good at their job. They're Michael Jordans, but they don't understand this esprit de corps, message of the triangle, and of sacrificing yourself for your teammates so they can do the same to you, so that you can be elevated, you can win. And yeah, maybe you'll not average as much points as you did, but you'll win 6 rings, and that's where you could become immortal.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a good place to close. I mean, I'm glad you brought up Michael Jordan, because I often think about him as a real warning case, because the things that made him great are also the things, as you said, that make him an asshole. And I've always been worried that, is there something in that lesson that you sort of have to be an asshole to be the best, that there's some ruthlessness or some bit of I don't know what it is, but just sort of lack of normal human empathy and behavior that you have to have in order to be that ruthless. But I think you're right. And in some ways, I mean, maybe Phil was really the leader of those Bulls teams.
Of course.
It was the dude who came in with the tribal drum and smoking in the locker room.
No, but this is what's great, Jacob. I'm not sure Phil understood the triangle. I don't know. Tex Winters was really the brains of the X and O's. Phil was a great coach. His out of bounds defensive and offensive schemes were great. But to me, absolutely Phil was the architect of this. Obviously, because he convinced MJ that he needed to give up the ball. And I'm sure Jordan was smart enough to know that the triangle was bullshit. The triangle, by the way, the triangle was designed for a post player. That's why when the Lakers instituted it with Shaq, it actually made sense. That was what it was. Like Longley was the middle of the triangle. It was a joke. It was just a psychological tool to create esprit de corps amongst the Bulls players so that they would sacrifice themselves for MJ. And yeah, so I absolutely think that what Phil shows is that the Phil Jackson's experience with the Bulls, it also shows that you need to modify your strategy based on the character and the qualities of the people around you. You cannot modify the people around you to your strategy. So if you're a leader and you have, you have to understand and not, you can't walk into to your office and have a team and say, I'm going to treat everyone the same because this is the style of manager I am. I don't think that works. I think you have to craft strategies based on the players you have. And I definitely think Phil Jackson, Steve Kerr, all these guys. And by the way, Steve Kerr obviously comes from the same coaching tree as Phil Jackson. Intriguingly, no one ever mentions that. Intriguingly, no one wants to give Phil Jackson the credit for basically having spawned a coaching tree that did give us another dynasty.
Yeah. What's the old Leo Strauss quote? I'm going to butcher it. It's something like, I can't remember now, but ridicule is usually the highest form of a compliment you can give. Like people go at the person who is most successful in their industry because they have nothing else to criticize them on. So you just say, oh, I don't like him, or oh, he's weird, or oh, he's dating the bus daughter, this, that, or the other thing, where it's like, no, he's like the most successful coach of all time. Maybe be cool.
Of all time, period. And a knock on him was that he didn't have a coaching tree. That was a knock. A couple of his assistants tried. I forgot the name of the guy who was the Dallas Mavericks coach for 2 seasons. He didn't do Crawford or something like that. He didn't do well. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, Steve Kerr obviously comes out of that. And the way that he has led, Golden State Warriors, and the way that they share the basketball and have the esprit de corps, I just think that's so important. And it's what fascinates me about basketball because, basketball is this interesting sport. In soccer, an individual cannot will their team to victory. They're a tragic character, like Messi in Argentina. There's 11. It's 100 meters by 30, 25. It's a big pitch. You cannot be everywhere. In tennis, obviously, it's all about the one person. It's an individual sport. In basketball, it's kind of in the middle. And that's what's tantalizingly amazing about it. You can be an incredible basketball player, just like a generational talent, and you are teased by the possibility, by the minute probability that you could be that one person that actually wills the entire team to a victory by yourself. James Harden fell in that trap. Russell Westbrook fell in the trap. Kevin Durant left the Warriors, fell in that trap. Allen Iverson, I don't think he ever fell into the trap. They designed a team around this kind of no, this time it will work. And it's never worked, Jacob. It has never worked. And it's what's incredibly human about basketball because it requires that great generational talent to say, I'm going to do less. I'm going to sacrifice myself. And that's very much I think, our human existence and our actual human experience.
Well, I think that's a really optimistic note to leave the podcast on. So, Cousin Marko, you'll be coming back more regularly. We look forward to having you. We try to give the people what they want here. Go back to pretending like you're still in Panama.
All right. I will do that. Thank you so much, Jacob.
Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.